The guard truck rumbled through the gates of the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, on a cold November morning in 1943. In the back, sitting shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, were Trent-Sink German prisoners of war. Hauptmann Werner Fischer pressed his face against the wire mesh window, watching the massive industrial complex emerge from the morning fog. At Ventuit, he had commanded a Panzer company in North Africa, had seen his unit equipped with what German propaganda claimed were the finest tanks in the world. The Tiger I, the Panther, machines that had struck fear into Allied tank crews across 3 continents. But Fischer had also seen those same magnificent tanks abandoned in the desert when the fuel ran out, when the spare parts never arrived, when the replacement engines were delayed for months. He had surrendered with his crew outside of Tunis in May, their Tiger immobilized not by enemy fire, but by a broken transmission that no German workshop within 6 miles had the parts to repair. Now, as the truck approached the factory gates, he had no idea that what he was about to witness would shatter every assumption he had ever held about German industrial superiority. The noise hit them first. Even through the closed windows of the guard building where they were being processed, the sound was overwhelming. The thunder of drop forges, the screech of metal on metal, the rhythmic hammering of pneumatic riveters. It was a symphony of industrial power conducted 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that never stopped, never slowed, never paused, for anything except the changing of shifts. "You will be working in Section D," the American lieutenant explained through an interpreter. "Your job is to assist with final assembly. You will follow instructions exactly. You will not speak to civilian workers unless spoken to first. You will be treated fairly if you work honestly." Fischer nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Through the window behind the lieutenant's desk, he could see the main production floor, and what he saw made no sense. Tanks, dozens of them, moving in a continuous line like automobiles on an assembly line, not being built one at a time in specialized workshops by master craftsmen as German tanks were produced, but moving steadily through stations where workers added components with mechanical precision. Fischer had toured the Henschel plant in Kassel before the war, had seen how German Tigers were painstakingly assembled over months. This was something entirely different. The factory floor of the Chrysler Tank Arsenal stretched before them like a cathedral of steel and noise. The building was enormous, over 1.5 million square feet under one roof. The main assembly line ran the entire length of the building, nearly half a mile of continuous production. At the far end, steel hulls arrived from the pressing plants. At the near end, completed Mequat Sherman tanks drove off under their own power, ready for combat. "Mein Gott," whispered Feldwebel Hans Müller, standing next to Fischer. Müller had worked in a Krupp steel plant before the war, understood industrial processes better than most soldiers. "They are building tanks like Ford builds automobiles." It was an observation that cut to the heart of American industrial strategy. While German factories treated each tank as a complex individual project, American engineers had broken down the construction process into simple, repeatable steps that could be performed by workers with minimal training. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touched you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first shock came at the welding station. In Germany, tank welding was done by certified craftsmen who had spent years learning their trade. Here, Fischer watched women, many of them housewives who had entered the workforce only months earlier, performing flawless welds on tank armor. 30 days training, the American foreman said through the interpreter, noticing Fischer's stare. "We can take someone who has never worked in a factory and have them welding tank armor to specification in 30 days. We train them, we pay them well, and they produce quality work." Fischer's diary, recovered after the war, captured his thoughts. Le 12 Novembre 1943. My first day in the American tank factory. I have seen what our propaganda ministry claimed was impossible. They are building Sherman tanks the way a baker makes bread. The line never stops. Every 45 minutes, another tank is completed. I counted 12 tanks finished just during the morning shift, 12 tanks in 4 hours. Our plant in Kassel produced 12 Tigers in 2 months. But the raw numbers were only part of the story. What truly shocked the German prisoners was the systematization of everything. At the engine installation station, 2 workers could fit a complete engine assembly into a tank hull in less than 15 minutes. In Germany, the same operation required 4 skilled mechanics and took more than a day. The difference was not the skill of the workers, but the design of the process. American engineers had designed the Sherman tank with mass production in mind from the very beginning. The engine compartment was standardized, the mounting points pre-machined, the connections simplified. Everything was designed to be assembled quickly by workers with basic training rather than slowly by highly skilled craftsmen. It was a fundamentally different approach to industrial production. Oberleutnant Karl Schmidt had been a production engineer at Daimler-Benz before the war. He had helped design components for German tanks and had taken pride in their complexity and sophistication. Now, watching the Chrysler production line, he began to understand the fatal flaw in German industrial thinking. "We designed our tanks to be superior machines," he told Fischer during their lunch break in the prisoner canteen. "The Americans designed their tanks to be superior products." The distinction was crucial. A Tiger tank was undoubtedly a more powerful fighting machine than a Sherman in direct combat. Its armor was thicker, its gun more powerful, its engineering more sophisticated. But none of that mattered if Tigers could only be produced at a fraction of the rate that Shermans rolled off American assembly lines. Germany had built approximately 347 Tiger I tanks during the entire war. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal alone produced more than 000 Shermans. The afternoon shift brought more revelations. Fischer and his detail were assigned to help with inventory management in one of the parts warehouses. The scale of it defied comprehension. Rows of shelving stretched for hundreds of yards, filled with spare parts for every component of a Sherman tank. "This is just one warehouse," the American supervisor explained. "We have 6 others like it on site. Every part for every tank is standardized. A transmission from any Sherman can be installed in any other Sherman. Try that with your Tigers." It was a calculated insult, but it was also undeniably true. German tanks were built with such tight tolerances and individual variation that parts from one Tiger often could not be fitted to another without extensive machine work. Field repair was a nightmare. American Shermans were designed with interchangeability as a fundamental principle. Any part could fit any tank, and repairs could be made quickly by ordinary mechanics with basic tools. During the evening break, the prisoners were led to a cafeteria that would have been considered luxurious by German factory standards. The food was abundant, hot, and nutritious: roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and real coffee. "This is how they feed their factory workers," Myler said quietly, looking at his plate. "Our soldiers at the front did not eat this well." But it was what Fischer overheard from a group of civilian workers at the next table that truly struck him. They were complaining about the quality of the coffee and discussing whether they should buy a new automobile now or wait until after the war when more models would be available. These were factory workers, not officers or party officials, casually discussing luxury purchases that would have been impossible for most German citizens even before the war. The night shift revealed the final, most devastating truth about American production. The factory never stopped. As the day shift workers headed home in their personal automobiles, the night shift arrived and took their places without missing a beat. The assembly line continued moving, the tanks continued rolling off the production floor, and the machinery continued its thunderous symphony of industrial power. 24 hours a day, Schmidt said, staring at the endless production line. 3 shifts, 8 hours each, 7 days a week. They never stop. They never even slow down. Fischer did the calculation in his head. If they were completing one tank every 45 minutes, running 24 hours a day, that meant 32 tanks per day. More than 2 cents per week. Nearly 1,000 per month, from just this one factory. How many factories like this do they have? Müller asked the interpreter during the walk back to the truck. The interpreter smiled. "This is one of 5 major tank plants. We also have smaller facilities producing components. Total production across all plants is running at about 2,000 tanks per month, sometimes more. The number hung in the air like an accusation. Germany's entire tank production for 1943 was approximately 2,000 units of all types, including obsolete models and assault guns. The United States was producing that many Shermans alone every 6 months, plus thousands of other armoured vehicles. Fischer's diary entry that night was longer and more detailed. November 12 à 13, 1943. I have witnessed something that makes me understand why. We are losing this war. It is not courage or skill or determination. It is mathematics. Cold, brutal mathematics. The Americans are producing tanks at a rate that makes victory impossible for Germany. They have turned warfare into a production problem, and they have solved it with industrial efficiency that we cannot match. Our Tiger tanks are better machines, but they are building 50 Shermans for every Tiger we produce. No amount of quality can overcome that quantity. The following week, Fischer's work detail was reassigned to the proving grounds adjacent to the factory. Here, completed tanks were tested before being shipped to ports for transport overseas. He watched as Sherman after Sherman roared through obstacle courses, fired their weapons at test ranges, and demonstrated their mechanical reliability. The Sherman is not the best tank in the world. An American Tank Corps captain told the prisoners during a lunch break, speaking through the interpreter. We know that. Your Tigers and Panthers are better in direct combat. But the Sherman is good enough. It's reliable. It's easy to maintain. It's simple to crew. And most importantly, we can build them faster than you can destroy them. It was a stark assessment that cut through all the propaganda and delusion. The captain continued, We lose Shermans in combat. Sometimes we lose several to take out one Tiger, but we can replace those Shermans in days. How long does it take you to replace a Tiger? Fischer had no answer. He knew it could take months to get a replacement Tiger to a frontline unit, if one came at all. The proving grounds revealed another dimension of American industrial power. Nearby was a facility where damaged tanks were being repaired and returned to service. The speed of the operation was stunning. Tanks that would have been written off as total loss by German standards were being completely rebuilt in a matter of days. We salvage everything. The tank's repair shop supervisor explained. A tank that is knocked out in France can be repaired in a depot in England and back in action within a week. Your Tigers? Once they are knocked out, they stay knocked out. By the end of his second week at the Chrysler Arsenal, Fischer had seen enough to understand the full scope of Germany's industrial disadvantage. It was not just about the number of tanks being produced. It was about the entire system, the whole industrial ecosystem that made such production possible. The factory ran on electricity generated by power plants that never failed. The workers drove to the factory in automobiles fueled by gasoline that was always available. The steel arrived on railways that ran on schedule. The rubber, copper, aluminum, and countless other materials flowed into the factory in an endless stream that never dried up. The whole system worked with mechanical precision because the entire American economy was organized to support it. In Germany, factories were being bombed, railways were being destroyed, materials were becoming scarce. Skilled workers were being drafted into the army, and the whole industrial system was slowly collapsing under the weight of Allied attacks and resource shortages. Even if German factories had been capable of matching American production rates, which they were not, the infrastructure to support such production no longer existed. Oberfeldwebel Johann Kruger, the senior NCO among the prisoner group, had fought in Poland, France, and Russia before being captured in North Africa. He had seen German industrial might at its peak in 1940, when the Wehrmacht seemed invincible. Now, working in an American factory, he understood what had changed. We thought we were the industrial power, he told Fischer during one of their rare private conversations. We saw our Tiger tanks and our rocket weapons and our jet fighters, and we thought we were superior, but we were building demonstration models. They are building production units. We have better weapons, they have more weapons, and in war, more is better. In that time, they witnessed the production of more than 3,000 Sherman tanks. They had seen firsthand the industrial miracle that was making American victory inevitable. They had learned that modern warfare was not about the quality of individual weapons, but about the capacity to produce enough weapons to overwhelm the enemy through sheer quantity. Fischer's final diary entry from the tank factory was dated le 10 février 1944. Today was my last day at the Chrysler plant. In 3 months, I have seen them build enough tanks to equip 60 Panzer divisions. Germany does not have 60 Panzer divisions. Germany does not have enough tanks to equip the divisions it does have. I understand now why the Führer's promise of wonder weapons is meaningless. It does not matter if we build a tank that is twice as good as a Sherman, if they can build 10 Shermans for every one of our tanks. The war was lost before it began, not on the battlefield but in the factories. The German prisoners were not alone in their observations. Samuel Morrison, a production supervisor at the Chrysler Arsenal, later recalled the reactions of the German POWs who worked under his supervision. They were good workers, disciplined and efficient, but they were also stunned by what they saw. I remember one officer, spoke pretty good English, told me that German propaganda had claimed America was on the verge of economic collapse. He said, seeing our factory made him realize that everything he had been told was a lie. He said they had been fighting a fantasy war against a real enemy. The story of German prisoners at American tank factories spread through the POWs. Letters were written, though heavily censored, back to Germany. Prisoners who were eventually repatriated brought stories of American and industrial might that contradicted official propaganda. The psychological impact was significant. Many German prisoners lost faith in the possibility of German victory after witnessing American production firsthand. Lieutenant Fischer was transferred to a POW camp in Arkansas, where he spent the remainder of the war working in agricultural labor. But the experience at the Chrysler Arsenal had permanently altered his understanding of the conflict. In letters to his wife that survived the war, he wrote about the abundance he had witnessed, the casual efficiency of American industry, and his certainty that Germany could never overcome such an advantage. The American worker drives a better car than a German general, he wrote in March 1944. The American factory runs day and night without stopping. The American system produces everything it needs and more. We were told Americans were weak, that they loved comfort too much to fight. But they have built a war machine that runs on comfort and abundance. They fight from a position of strength that we never understood. The impact of such testimonies on German morale was significant. As more prisoners returned from America after the war, they brought with them stories of American prosperity and industrial capacity that made German propaganda appear absurd. The claim that Germany had been fighting a righteous war against decadent enemies became impossible to sustain when those enemies could produce tanks by the thousand, while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded German peacetime prosperity. But the lessons of American tank production went beyond mere numbers. The Chrysler Arsenal, and facilities like it, represented a fundamentally different approach to industrial warfare. American engineers had understood that in a prolonged conflict, the side that could produce adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers would defeat the side that produced superior weapons in limited quantities. The Sherman tank was not the best tank of World War II by most technical measures. It was outgunned by German Tigers and Panthers. Its armor was thinner, its mechanical sophistication was less impressive, but it was reliable, maintainable, mass-producible, and most importantly, there were always more Shermans. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more were on ships heading to the front. German tank crews fought heroically, but they were fighting mathematics, and mathematics always wins. The production philosophy that created the Sherman also created American victory. It was a philosophy based on standardization, interchangeability, mass production, and the understanding that good enough, in sufficient quantity, was better than perfect in limited supply. It was a philosophy made possible by American industrial capacity, American resources, American workers, and an American economy that could support total war while simultaneously improving civilian living standards. The German prisoners who witnessed this system firsthand became, inadvertently, historians of American industrial power. Their observations, recorded in diaries, letters, and post-war interviews, provided evidence that the Second World War had been decided not by military strategy or tactical innovation, but by industrial capacity. Their testimony showed that Germany's defeat had been inevitable from the moment American factories began operating at full war production. Werner Fischer survived the war and returned to Germany in 1946. He became an engineer in the reconstruction of German industry, applying lessons he had learned during his captivity. In interviews later in life, he spoke about his time at the Chrysler Arsenal with a mixture of respect and resignation. "We thought we were fighting a war," he said in 1972, "but America was running a production line. You cannot defeat a production line with courage or skill, you can only match it with another production line, and Germany never had the capacity to do that." German prisoners witnessing American tank production was the story of industrial warfare in the 20th century. It demonstrated that modern conflicts were decided not by the quality of weapons, but by the quantity of production. It showed that economic capacity was more important than military skill, that logistics trumped tactics, and that abundance defeated excellence. The Trent-sank German prisoners who worked at the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in late 1943 and early 1940 witnessed approximately 3,000 tanks being built. In the same period, Germany's entire industrial capacity produced approximately 500 tanks of all types. The prisoners had seen with their own eyes why Germany was losing the war. They had learned that the conflict was being decided not in the skies over Berlin or on the beaches of Normandy, but on the production floors of factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. Their captivity had been an education in the reality of modern warfare. Their testimony stood as evidence that the Second World War had been won in American factories before it was won on European battlefields, and their stories provided compelling proof that industrial capacity, not military valor, had been the decisive factor in Allied victory. The American system that had stunned German prisoners was the same system that made victory inevitable. The capacity to produce 150 tanks in a single day was not just a production statistic, it was a death sentence for any nation that tried to match American industrial output through traditional methods. Germany had built beautiful machines, America had built a production system, and in total war, the production system always wins. The spring of 1944 brought a new assignment for Fischer and his fellow prisoners. They were transferred to the Ford River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, a facility so vast it made the Chrysler Arsenal look modest by comparison. The Rouge was not just a tank factory. It was an entire industrial ecosystem spanning over 2,000 acres, containing 93 buildings with nearly 16 million square feet of factory floor space. "This is not a factory," Mueller whispered as their transport truck passed through the main gates. "This is a city built to make war." He was not wrong. The Rouge complex had its own steel mill, its own power plant, its own docks on the Rouge River where ore boats arrived with raw materials. At one end of the complex, iron ore and coal entered. At the other end, completed military vehicles drove away under their own power. The scale defied comprehension. More than 85,000 workers laboured at the Rouge on 3 shifts around the clock. The facility consumed more electricity than many German cities. The steel mill alone produced enough metal to build a destroyer every week. And this was just one facility among dozens scattered across the American industrial heartland. Fischer's work detail was assigned to the engine production building, a structure that covered 40 acres under a single roof. Here, American workers assembled tank engines with the same efficiency they had once used to build automobile engines. The production line moved continuously, engines progressing from bare blocks to completed units in a matter of hours rather than days. What shocked Fischer most was not the speed, but the precision. Each engine was tested, measured, and certified before leaving the production line. Quality control was not an afterthought, but an integral part of the process. Defective components were caught early, rejected, and replaced. The result was engines that, while perhaps less sophisticated than German designs, were remarkably reliable and consistent. In Germany, we believed American workers were lazy, Schmidt said during a lunch break, watching a team of workers efficiently swap out a faulty component on the production line. We thought their love of comfort made them weak, but they have organized their comfort into a system that produces more than our discipline ever could. The observation cut to a deeper truth about American industrial philosophy. German factories operated on principles of hierarchy, discipline, and craftsmanship. Workers were expected to follow orders and perform tasks exactly as instructed. Initiative was discouraged. Innovation came from engineers and managers, never from the shop floor. American factories operated differently. Workers were encouraged to suggest improvements. Production managers actively solicited ideas from the people who actually operated the machinery. If a worker found a better way to install a component, that method was tested, refined, and incorporated into the standard procedure. The result was continuous improvement, driven by the people who knew the process best. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Fischer witnessed this firsthand when a young female worker approached a supervisor with a suggestion for reorganizing the parts bins at her station. The supervisor listened, tested her idea, and within 2 days, the new arrangement had been implemented across the entire production line. The change saved approximately 30 seconds per engine assembly, a tiny improvement that, multiplied across thousands of engines, saved hundreds of hours of production time. They treat their workers like thinking human beings, Kruger observed, not like interchangeable parts in a machine. It was an ironic observation given that American factories were famous for treating products as interchangeable parts. But the human workers who built those products were valued, respected, and compensated in ways that German workers could barely imagine. The wages confirmed it. Fischer learned that the starting pay for an unskilled worker at the Rouge was $1 per hour, approximately $40 per week for a standard work week. Skilled workers earned considerably more, sometimes exceeding $60 per week. These were wages that would have been considered generous for German engineers before the war, being paid to American factory workers who had learned their skills in a matter of weeks. But the wages were only part of the story. The benefits were equally remarkable. Workers received paid vacations, health insurance, and retirement pensions. The factory cafeteria served subsidized meals of a quality and quantity that Fischer had not seen since before the war began. Workers had access to company-sponsored recreational facilities, libraries, and educational programs. "They are bribing their workers with prosperity," Müller said one evening. But Fischer shook his head. "No. They are investing in their workers. A well-fed, well-paid, well-treated worker produces more and produces better. It is not kindness. It is efficiency." The insight was crucial. American industrial managers had understood what German industrialists had not, that human capital was as important as physical capital. A factory was only as productive as the workers who operated it. Workers who were healthy, educated, motivated, and well compensated produced better results than workers who were merely obedient. The proof was everywhere. Despite employing thousands of workers with minimal training, despite using simplified production methods, despite designing tanks for ease of manufacture rather than technical sophistication, American factories produced reliable, effective military equipment at rates that German factories could not match even with their highly skilled craftsmen and complex processes. In April 1944, Fischer's detail witnessed something that crystallized the entire experience. A delegation of Soviet military observers visited the Rouge complex to inspect American tank production. The Germans watched from a distance as the Soviet officers toured the facility, their faces showing the same shock and disbelief that Fischer had felt 6 months earlier. Through the interpreter, Fischer overheard fragments of the Soviet officers' conversation. They were discussing the implications of American production capacity for the post-war world. They understood, as Fischer had come to understand, that the nation capable of this level of industrial output would dominate the second half of the 20th century. The war's outcome was no longer in question. The only question was what would happen after the war ended. That evening, Fischer wrote in his diary, "The 15th of April, 1944. Today I saw Soviet officers witness what I witnessed. They understand what I understand. America has not merely won this war. America has changed what it means to win a war. They have industrialized victory itself. Future conflicts will be decided not by who has the best soldiers or the best generals, but by who has the best factories. And America has shown the world how to build the best factories." The observation was prophetic. The industrial methods pioneered in American war plants during World War II would become the foundation for post-war economic dominance. The techniques of mass production, quality control, continuous improvement, and worker empowerment that Fischer witnessed at the Rouge would spread throughout the world, transforming global manufacturing. But in 1944, these implications were still theoretical. The immediate reality was that German prisoners were watching American factories produce the weapons that were defeating German armies in Europe. Every tank that rolled off the production line was another nail in Germany's coffin. Every engine that passed inspection was another step toward inevitable defeat. The psychological impact on the prisoners was profound. Many had begun the war believing in German superiority, convinced by propaganda that German engineering, German discipline, and German will would overcome any material disadvantage. Working in American factories destroyed those illusions completely. "We were fighting a fantasy," Kruger said one night in the prisoner barracks. "We believed our Tigers were invincible because they could destroy Shermans in single combat. But for every Tiger we built, they built 50 Shermans. We believed our soldiers were superior because they were better trained. But training means nothing when you are outnumbered 10-1. We believed we would win because we wanted it more. But desire cannot defeat production." The bitterness in his voice reflected the broader demoralization spreading through the prisoner population. As word spread through POW camps about American industrial capacity, the belief in possible German victory evaporated. Prisoners who had maintained hope of rescue or reversal of fortune abandoned those dreams when confronted with evidence of overwhelming American material superiority. Some prisoners responded with anger, refusing to accept what they had seen, clinging to propaganda claims of secret weapons and miracle technologies that would turn the tide. But most, like Fischer, responded with resignation and a grim understanding of reality. The war was lost. Germany would be defeated. The only question was how much more destruction would occur before the inevitable end. In June 1944, news reached the POW camps of the Allied invasion of Normandy. For the prisoners working in American factories, the significance was immediate. They had seen the tanks, trucks, weapons, and equipment being produced. They knew that American factories were supplying not just American forces, but British, Canadian, and Free French forces as well. The invasion was not just a military operation. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial power being unleashed on the European continent. Fischer's diary entry for the 6th of June 1944 was brief. "The invasion has begun. I have seen the weapons they will use. Germany cannot stop what is coming." The summer of 1944 brought increasing evidence that Fischer was correct. News from Europe, heavily filtered but still informative, indicated that German armies were being pushed back on all fronts. In the east, Soviet forces were advancing with equipment supplied partially by American Lend-Lease production. In the west, Allied forces were breaking out of Normandy with overwhelming material superiority. The prisoners at the Rouge watched as production rates increased even further. The assembly lines moved faster, the shifts grew longer, the output climbed higher. By July 1944, American factories were producing more than 2,000 tanks per month, along with thousands of other armored vehicles, tens of thousands of trucks, hundreds of aircraft, and millions of weapons and ammunition. How does anyone defeat this? Muller asked rhetorically, watching another batch of completed tanks drive off the production floor. No one had an answer because there was no answer. You could not defeat American production. You could only hope to survive it. Fischer's final months at the Rouge were marked by a growing sense of irrelevance. The outcome of the war was decided. American victory was certain. The prisoners were no longer participants in the conflict, but witnesses to its conclusion. They worked their shifts, ate their meals, and waited for the end. In December 1944, Fischer was transferred to a different facility, ending his time at the Ford Rouge complex. In 6 months there, he had witnessed the production of more than 10,000 engines, components for thousands of tanks and vehicles. He had seen American industrial power at its peak, operating with ruthless efficiency to produce the weapons of war in quantities that made victory inevitable and defeat certain. His final diary entry from the Rouge was dated the 20th of December 1944. Today I leave this place. I came here as a prisoner of war. I leave as a witness to the power that defeated my nation. I have seen the future, and it is American. The factories I have worked in will win this war and shape the peace that follows. Germany gambled everything on military superiority. America built its victory in factories like this one. They did not outfight us. They outproduced us. And in modern war, production is victory. The winter of 1945 found Fischer at a smaller facility in Cleveland, Ohio, a plant that specialized in producing tank components rather than complete vehicles. If the Chrysler Arsenal and the Ford Rouge complex had been cathedrals of mass production, this was a monastery dedicated to the perfection of individual parts. Here, Fischer gained insight into another dimension of American industrial superiority, the supply chain. The Cleveland plant produced transmissions, gearboxes, and drivetrain components for Sherman tanks. These parts were then shipped to final assembly plants across the country where they were installed in tanks alongside engines from Detroit, armor from Pittsburgh, guns from Connecticut, and electronics from Massachusetts. The entire American industrial heartland was one vast, interconnected machine producing weapons of war. This is what we never understood, Schmidt said, examining a shipping manifest that listed destinations for the day's production. We thought industrial power meant building everything in one place. They understand that industrial power means coordinating everything from many places. The observation was astute. German industrial planning had emphasized concentrated production in massive facilities that could be supervised and controlled by party officials. American industrial planning emphasized distributed production across multiple facilities that could be coordinated through logistics and standardization. When Allied bombers destroyed a German factory, production stopped. When they bombed an American component plant, other plants simply increased their output to compensate. Fischer's job at the Cleveland plant involved quality inspection of completed transmissions. Each unit was tested on specialized equipment that simulated operational conditions, measured performance parameters, and identified defects before the transmission left the factory. The rejection rate was surprisingly high, nearly 80% of units failed. Initial inspection. But what impressed Fischer was not the failure rate, but what happened to the failed units. In German factories, defective components were often reworked by hand, a time-consuming process that created bottlenecks in production. At the Cleveland plant, defective transmissions were disassembled on a separate line, the faulty parts identified and replaced, and the unit reassembled and retested. The entire process took less than a day, and the rebuilt transmissions were indistinguishable from new units. They have industrialized quality control, Fischer wrote in his diary. They do not try to prevent all defects. They accept that defects will occur, and they have created systems to identify and correct them quickly. It is a different philosophy. Not perfection, but acceptable quality at high volume. The philosophy extended to maintenance and repair. Fischer learned that American military doctrine emphasized field replacement of entire assemblies rather than component-level repair. If a Sherman tank's transmission failed in combat, the crew did not repair it. They removed the entire transmission assembly and installed a new one. The defective transmission was sent to a rear area depot, where it was rebuilt by specialists. This approach minimized downtime and kept tanks operational. "We repair our tanks in the field," Kruger observed. "It takes days and requires skilled mechanics. They replace entire assemblies in hours using ordinary soldiers. Their tanks spend more time fighting and less time being repaired." It was another example of American military efficiency trumping German technical sophistication. A Tiger tank might be more powerful than a Sherman, but if the Tiger spent half its time undergoing maintenance while the Sherman was operational 90% of the time, the Sherman was the more effective weapon. The Cleveland plant also revealed the depth of American industrial mobilization. Many of the workers were women, some elderly men, too old for military service, and even some disabled veterans who had returned from the war and taken factory jobs. The workforce was diverse in ways that would have been unthinkable in German factories, where racial ideology and rigid social hierarchies limited who could work in critical industries. Fischer watched a black woman, perhaps 30 years old, supervising a production team that included white men, elderly workers, and recent immigrants. In Germany, such a scene would have been impossible. Here, it was unremarkable. The American system valued competence over ideology, results over racial purity. "They use everyone," Muller said with something approaching admiration. "Old men, women, Negroes, immigrants. Everyone who can contribute does contribute. We excluded half our population from industrial work because of ideology. They included everyone because of practicality." The observation highlighted one of Germany's fundamental strategic errors. By limiting industrial employment to those deemed racially and politically acceptable, Germany had artificially constrained its workforce. America, facing similar labor shortages after millions of men entered military service, had simply expanded the definition of who could work in defense industries. The result was a workforce that was larger, more diverse, and ultimately more productive. In February 1945, news reached the POW camps that the Allies had crossed the Rhine. For Fischer and his fellow prisoners, the military implications were obvious. Germany was defeated, the war would end soon, but the industrial implications were equally clear. American factories had produced enough weapons, equipment, and supplies to not just defeat Germany, but to do so while simultaneously fighting Japan in the Pacific. "They are fighting two wars," Schmidt said, reading a translated newspaper article about Pacific operations. "Two complete wars, on opposite sides of the world, and they are winning both." How is this possible? Fischer knew the answer. He had seen it in the factories. American industrial capacity was so vast that it could support multiple simultaneous military campaigns while maintaining civilian prosperity. German industry had struggled to support a single front. American industry supported global operations without strain. The evidence was everywhere. The prisoners ate better food in American captivity than German civilians were eating at home. The guards wore uniforms made from better materials than German military uniforms. The trucks that transported prisoners were newer and better maintained than the vehicles Fischer had commanded in North Africa. Every detail spoke to the vast disparity in productive capacity. In March 1945, Fischer was part of a work detail that visited a scrapyard adjacent to the Cleveland plant. Here, damaged or obsolete equipment was processed for recycling. Mountains of scrap metal waited to be melted down and transformed into new weapons. What struck Fischer was the casual waste. Equipment that would have been carefully hoarded and repaired in Germany was simply scrapped and recycled in America. "Look at this," Muller said, examining a damaged machine tool that had been discarded. "This could be repaired. In Germany, we would spend weeks fixing this. Here, they throw it away and buy a new one." It was not waste, Fischer realized. It was efficiency. The cost of repairing old equipment exceeded the cost of buying new equipment, so Americans simply replaced rather than repaired. They could afford to do this because their factories produced enough new equipment that old equipment became disposable. It was an approach made possible only by enormous productive capacity. The scrapyard also contained damaged military equipment returned from overseas, tanks with battle damage, vehicles destroyed in accidents, equipment that had reached the end of its service life. All of it was being recycled, the metal reclaimed and returned to the production cycle. Even in destruction, the American system was efficient. They waste nothing and they waste everything, Kruger said, a paradoxical observation that captured the essence of American industrial philosophy. Individual items were treated as disposable, but the materials they contained were carefully recycled. Specific equipment was considered expendable, but productive capacity itself was preserved and enhanced. April brought news of President Roosevelt's death, an event that caused genuine sadness among some of the American workers Fischer had come to know. The funeral was broadcast on the factory's public address system, and production stopped for a brief memorial. Fischer was struck by the genuine emotion displayed by the workers. Despite being in the midst of total war, despite working long hours to produce weapons of destruction, the American workers maintained a connection to civilian life and political leadership that German workers had lost. They are not militarized, Schmidt observed. They have built the greatest war machine in history, but they have not become a militaristic society. The factories produce weapons, but the workers remain civilians. They have mobilized for war without being consumed by it. It was a crucial distinction. Germany had attempted to create a warrior society, had subordinated everything to military necessity, had organized the entire nation for conquest. America had simply mobilized its industrial capacity for military production while maintaining the fundamental character of civilian society. German workers served the state, American workers served themselves, and in doing so, served their nation more effectively. The final days of Fischer's time at the Cleveland plant coincided with the final days of the European War. News of Hitler's death reached the camp on May 11th. The unconditional surrender came a week later. For Fischer and his fellow prisoners, the end brought not relief but a kind of emotional numbness. The war they had fought was over, but the future remained uncertain. "We lost," Müller said simply, on the day the surrender was announced. "We always knew we would lose after we saw these factories, but knowing and experiencing are different things." Fischer's diary entry for May 1945 was longer and more reflective than usual. "Today, the war ended. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. I have been a prisoner for 2 years, and in that time I have learned more about warfare than I learned in 4 years of fighting. I learned that modern war is not decided by bravery or skill or tactical innovation. It is decided by production capacity, by industrial organization, by economic resources. Germany lost this war not because our soldiers were inferior, but because our factories were inadequate. We built beautiful weapons. America built sufficient weapons, and sufficient always defeats beautiful." The weeks following the German surrender brought changes to the POW camps. The prisoners were no longer enemies, but simply displaced persons waiting to return home. Work assignments continued, but the urgency had vanished. The factories still operated, but now they were converting from military to civilian production. The same assembly lines that had built tank transmissions were being retooled to build automobile transmissions. Fischer watched the conversion with fascination. The transition from war production to peace production took only weeks. The industrial infrastructure remained intact, the workforce remained employed, and the productive capacity continued operating. Germany's factories lay in ruins, destroyed by bombing or dismantled by occupation forces. American factories simply changed what they were producing. "This is how they will win the peace," Schmidt said, watching workers dismantle military production equipment and install civilian production machinery. "The same system that defeated us militarily will dominate us economically. They have not just won the war. They have positioned themselves to control the post-war world." In June 1945, Fischer and his fellow prisoners were transferred to a repatriation camp in New York, the first step in their eventual return to Germany. But before leaving Cleveland, Fischer was given permission to write a final letter to his wife, the first uncensored communication he had been allowed in 2 years. The letter, preserved in family archives, concluded with these words: "I am coming home to a Germany that no longer exists. The nation we fought for is gone, defeated not by superior armies but by superior factories. I have seen the power that destroyed us, and I have learned that we were defeated before we began. America did not outfight us, they outproduced us. And in the end, production was everything. I return home with this knowledge, hoping it will help us build a better future from the ruins of our foolish past."